The scream that echoed through Bel Reeve Plantation's main house on that sweltering August night in 1854 wasn't the triumphant cry of a newborn entering the world. It was the anguished wail of Mistress Katherine Harrow, realizing that her fourth pregnancy had ended like the three before it, with a perfectly formed stillborn child, delivered by the same enslaved midwife who had brought dead baby after dead baby into the world, while offering sympathetic words that masked the calculated satisfaction of someone conducting the most perfect revenge Louisiana's plantation society would ever witness. Delphine Rousseau, a 42-year-old woman whose own 6 children had been torn from her arms and sold to distant plantations, while she was forced to nurture the offspring of the woman who ordered those sales, stood in that birthing room, holding another lifeless infant and thinking about the precise botanical knowledge that had made this moment possible. If you're ready to discover how an enslaved midwife used her intimate access to pregnancy and childbirth to systematically eliminate her mistress's ability to produce the heirs that plantation dynasties depended on, ensuring that the Harrow bloodline would die without legacy or continuation, hit that subscribe button right now, smash that like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Delphine accomplished over 4 years of patient application of herbal remedies that appeared to be health treatments, but were actually instruments of biological warfare, will challenge everything you thought you knew about resistance, revenge, and the terrible power that enslaved women wielded over the most intimate aspects of their oppressors' lives, when knowledge of plants and bodies became weapon more devastating than any whip or gun. The woman who would end the Harrow bloodline through application of botanical knowledge, passed down through generations of African healers, had been born in 1812 in Saint-Domingue, what would become Haiti, after the revolution that terrified every white plantation owner in the Americas. Delphine's mother had been a sage femme, a midwife who served both enslaved women and the French colonial elite before the uprising of 1791 forced their family to flee to Louisiana. The knowledge her mother carried about plants that encouraged fertility and plants that prevented it, about herbs that eased childbirth and herbs that complicated it, about the dozens of ways that botanical wisdom could control human reproduction, had been carefully transmitted to young Delphine during the years before cholera took her mother in 1825. By 1854, Louisiana had emerged as one of the wealthiest slave states in the American South, its economy built on sugar and cotton cultivation that required brutal exploitation of approximately 331,000 enslaved people. The state's Code Noir, inherited from French colonial law and modified after American purchase in 1803, created legal framework that classified enslaved people as movable property, while paradoxically requiring masters to provide food, clothing, and basic care. But the code's restrictions on family separation were routinely ignored by planters who prioritized profit over the minimal protections the law theoretically provided. Children could be sold away from mothers after age 10. Marriages between enslaved people had no legal standing. Family units existed only at the master's pleasure and could be destroyed whenever economic necessity or personal whim dictated. Bel Reeve sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime sugarland along the Mississippi River south of Baton Rouge. The plantation had been established in 1798 by Katherine Harrow's grandfather, built into prosperity through the labor of enslaved workers, whose numbers had grown to 180 by 1854. The main house was an imposing Greek Revival structure with massive columns and elaborate wrought iron galleries, its architectural grandeur announcing the Harrow family's wealth and social position. But for Delphine, who had lived at Bel Reeve since being purchased in 1830, the house represented something darker, the place where her children had been taken from her one by one, where Katherine Harrow had ordered their sales with casual cruelty that suggested enslaved motherhood meant nothing compared to the economic value of young workers. Mistress Katherine Harrow, 31 years old in 1854, embodied Louisiana's plantation aristocracy at its most vicious intersection of refinement and brutality. Educated at a New Orleans finishing school, fluent in French and English, accomplished in music and needlework, Katherine maintained elaborate social graces when entertaining neighboring plantation families. But beneath the cultured exterior lived someone whose sense of entitlement was so complete that she viewed enslaved people as extensions of her will rather than humans with their own desires, needs, or familial bonds. Her cruelty wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was the quiet, systematic destruction of others' lives, conducted with the certainty that her actions were not just legal, but morally justified by her racial and class superiority. Delphine's relationship with Katherine had begun in 1830, when the 18-year-old Delphine was purchased specifically for her midwifery skills. Katherine's mother had been seeking someone to assist with plantation births, both for the enslaved women, whose reproductive capacity represented economic investment, and for Katherine herself when she eventually married and began producing the heirs necessary for continuing the Harrow dynasty. The irony that Delphine would eventually use those very skills to prevent such heirs from surviving wouldn't become apparent for 2 more decades, during which Delphine established herself as Bel Reeve's most valuable medical resource, while secretly grieving the children that Katherine's economic decisions had stolen from her. The first child Delphine lost to Katherine's orders had been her son James, sold in 1832 when he turned 10 years old. Louisiana law technically prohibited separating children from mothers before that age, though enforcement was non-existent. Katherine had sold James to a Mississippi cotton plantation for $800, reasoning that the boy's value had peaked and that keeping him would represent lost capital. Delphine had begged, had abandoned the submissive mask that survival required, and openly pleaded for her son to remain at Bel Reeve. Katherine's response had been to order Delphine whipped for impertinence, 10 lashes delivered by the overseer, while James watched before being loaded onto the wagon that would carry him away forever. The second loss came in 1835, when Delphine's daughter Marie was sold at age 11 to a New Orleans household as domestic servant. The third was in 1838. Twin boys, Samuel and Benjamin, sold together to a sugar plantation in La Fourche Parish when they reached working age. The fourth loss occurred in 1841, when her daughter Sarah was sold at age 12. The fifth came in 1844, her son Thomas, age 10, sold to a cotton operation in northern Louisiana. The sixth and final loss was in 1847, when her youngest daughter Grace was sold at age 11 to a plantation in Texas. 6 children conceived, birthed, nursed and raised during stolen moments between serving Katherine's needs, all torn away and scattered across the South in transactions that enriched the Harrow family, while destroying Delphine's. Each sale had been accompanied by Katherine's assurances that separation was economically necessary, that enslaved family bonds were sentimentality that couldn't be allowed to interfere with plantation management, that Delphine should be grateful her children were being sold to respectable establishments rather than to slave traders who might place them in harsher conditions. The condescension in Katherine's voice during these conversations, the tone suggesting she was doing Delphine a favor by considering her feelings at all, had been more devastating than simple cruelty. It revealed that Katherine genuinely didn't comprehend that enslaved mothers loved their children with the same fierce intensity that white mothers did, that family destruction caused real anguish rather than mere inconvenience. The transformation of grief into calculated plan for revenge began in 1850 when Katherine married Philip Harrow, a distant cousin whose union with her consolidated family holdings and preserved the bloodline's purity that Louisiana's plantation aristocracy valued obsessively. Katherine announced her first pregnancy in early 1851 with triumphant certainty that motherhood would cement her social position and provide the male heir necessary for continuing the family legacy. She summoned Delphine to the main house and informed her that she would be responsible for ensuring successful pregnancy and delivery, that her decades of experience birthing enslaved children would now serve the infinitely more important purpose of bringing Harrow heirs into the world. The request created opportunity that Delphine had been unconsciously preparing for since losing James 20 years earlier. Her mother's teachings had covered not just herbs that aided fertility and childbirth, but also plants that prevented conception, caused miscarriage, or ensured stillbirth when administered carefully over extended periods. The knowledge had been transmitted as pragmatic survival tool, ways that enslaved women could control their own reproduction to prevent bringing children into bondage. But Delphine recognized that the same botanical wisdom could serve darker purposes when applied to women whose own fertility had become weapon against someone who had spent 2 decades destroying enslaved families without consequence or remorse. The herbs Delphine selected for her purpose grew throughout Louisiana's subtropical landscape: pennyroyal, tansy, black cohosh, cotton rootbark, plants that white doctors dismissed as folk remedies, but that African and indigenous midwives knew possessed powerful abortifacient properties when prepared and administered correctly. The key was dosage and timing. Too much would cause obvious symptoms that might be traced back to deliberate poisoning. Too little would fail to prevent successful pregnancy. But precise amounts, administered consistently through teas and tonics that appeared to be health-promoting treatments for pregnancy, could create a pattern of reproductive failure that would appear to be Katherine's own biological inadequacy rather than someone else's calculated intervention. Katherine's first pregnancy progressed normally through the first trimester. Delphine attended her daily, brewing teas from herbs she claimed would strengthen the pregnancy and ensure healthy delivery. She spoke soothingly about the process, shared stories of other successful births she had attended, and maintained the mask of devoted servant, grateful for the privilege of serving her mistress during this sacred time. But the herbs she selected contained carefully calibrated amounts of compounds that would prevent the fetus from developing properly while avoiding symptoms dramatic enough to raise suspicion before the pregnancy reached its inevitable conclusion. The first stillbirth occurred in September 1851. Katherine's labor had been normal, painful, but progressing according to expected patterns. But when the infant finally emerged after 12 hours of contractions, it was perfectly formed but lifeless. Its heart stopped sometime during the final weeks of pregnancy, in ways that appeared to be tragic accident rather than deliberate outcome. Katherine's grief was profound and genuine. She had spent months preparing for motherhood, decorating a nursery, purchasing elaborate christening gowns, planning the celebration that would announce the Harrow family's continuation into the next generation. The stillbirth shattered those plans and raised the first whispers of anxiety about whether she was capable of producing the heirs her family and social position demanded. Delphine offered sympathy that concealed satisfaction. She explained that first pregnancies sometimes ended this way, that Katherine was young and would certainly conceive again, that the next pregnancy would likely be successful. She prepared recovery tonics that she claimed would restore Katherine's strength and prepare her body for another attempt at motherhood. Katherine accepted the care and the reassurances, never imagining that the woman holding her hand and wiping her tears had deliberately caused the loss and was already planning to repeat the process however many times proved necessary to ensure that no living Harrow heir would ever be born. The second pregnancy began in early 1852. Katherine approached this attempt with nervous hope, constantly seeking Delphine's reassurance that everything was progressing normally. Delphine provided that reassurance while carefully continuing the botanical intervention that would produce the same result as before. She varied the herbs slightly, using different plants with similar properties to avoid any pattern that might be noticed if someone decided to investigate the treatments she was providing. She maintained detailed mental records of what she administered and when, ensuring that her application of herbal abortifacients remained consistent enough to be effective, but varied enough to appear random. The second stillbirth occurred in October 1852. The pattern was identical to the first, normal labor producing a perfectly formed but lifeless infant. Katherine's grief this time was complicated by growing fear that something was fundamentally wrong with her body, that she was failing in the most basic duty that plantation wives owed their families and their class. She consulted doctors from New Orleans who examined her and found no obvious physical problems. They suggested that she was perhaps too anxious, that nervous tension might be preventing successful pregnancy, that she should relax and trust in God's plan. The medical establishment of 1850s Louisiana had no tools for detecting the kind of deliberate herbal intervention that Delphine was conducting, and no framework for imagining that an enslaved midwife might possess both the knowledge and the motivation to systematically sabotage her mistress's reproduction. The psychological impact of 2 consecutive stillbirths transformed Katherine from confident plantation mistress into someone consumed by desperate need for successful pregnancy. She became obsessive about following Delphine's advice, drinking every tea and tonic without question, believing that the midwife who had attended dozens of successful births among the enslaved population represented her best hope for finally producing a living child. The irony that she was placing complete trust in someone who was deliberately ensuring her failure never occurred to Katherine, whose fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy made it impossible to imagine that an enslaved woman might possess the intelligence and determination necessary for such sophisticated revenge. The third pregnancy began in early 1853. By this point, Katherine's anxiety had become pathological. She spent most of her time in bed, avoiding any activity that might threaten the pregnancy. She summoned Delphine constantly, demanding reassurance that the pregnancy was progressing normally, that this time would be different, that she would finally hold a living child. Delphine provided that reassurance while continuing the botanical intervention with minor modifications based on what she had learned from the previous 2 attempts. She had refined her technique, identifying the optimal timing and dosage for ensuring stillbirth, while minimizing any symptoms that might raise suspicion about external causes. The 3rd stillbirth occurred in November 1853. Katherine's breakdown after this loss was complete. She stopped eating regularly, refused to leave her room, spent days weeping over the 3 perfectly formed but lifeless infants who represented not just personal tragedy, but dynastic failure. The neighboring plantation families who had celebrated her marriage to Philip with confident expectations of Harrow heirs now whispered that perhaps Katherine was cursed, that some families simply couldn't produce the next generation, that the bloodline might end with her, despite all her privilege and position. The whispers devastated Katherine more than the physical losses, revealing that her value in Louisiana's plantation society was entirely contingent on her reproductive capacity. Philip Harrow's response to 3 consecutive stillbirths revealed the practical brutality underlying plantation marriages. He began spending more time away from Bel Reeve, visiting New Orleans for weeks at a time, conducting business that everyone understood included relationships with enslaved women and free women of color who could provide the sexual satisfaction and possibly the children that his wife apparently couldn't. The humiliation of Philip's absences added another layer to Katherine's suffering, transforming the stillbirths from personal tragedy into public failure that threatened her social position and her marriage. The 4th pregnancy, beginning in early 1854, represented Katherine's last desperate attempt at biological redemption. She was 31 years old, not old by modern standards, but approaching the age when 19th century women's fertility began declining noticeably. Doctors had warned that if this pregnancy failed, her chances of ever producing living children would diminish significantly. Katherine approached this pregnancy with frantic determination, following Delphine's instructions with religious devotion, praying constantly, making promises to God about what a good mother she would be if only he would grant her one living child. Delphine watched Katherine's desperation with emotions that mixed satisfaction and something approaching pity. The satisfaction came from understanding that her revenge was working exactly as intended, that the woman who had sold 6 children without apparent remorse was now experiencing a fraction of the grief that such losses created. But the pity came from recognizing that Katherine genuinely didn't comprehend the connection between Delphine's losses and her own, didn't understand that what was happening to her was precisely calibrated justice rather than random biological tragedy. Katherine's inability to see the parallel revealed the depths of her moral blindness about enslaved humanity. The 4th pregnancy progressed through spring and summer of 1854, with Katherine confined to bed rest and Delphine attending her constantly. The enslaved community at Bel Reeve watched the situation with growing awareness that something significant was happening, though most didn't know the specific details of Delphine's intervention. They saw that Mistress Katherine, who had casually destroyed so many enslaved families, was being denied the family she desperately wanted. They saw that Delphine, who had lost 6 children to sales, was the one attending Katherine during her failed attempts at motherhood. The symbolism wasn't lost on people who understood that sometimes justice came not through dramatic rebellion, but through quiet application of knowledge that white people didn't realize enslaved people possessed. The night of August 15, 1854, brought the culmination of 4 years of patient botanical warfare. Katherine's labor began in the afternoon and continued through the evening as Delphine attended with the same careful attention she had provided for 3 previous stillbirths. As Katherine screamed and pushed in the candlelit bedroom, Delphine prepared for the moment when she would deliver another perfectly formed but lifeless infant, the 4th and final proof that the Harrow bloodline would end with Katherine, that no heir would inherit Bel Reeve, that the dynasty built on enslaved labor and destroyed enslaved families would die without continuation into the next generation. The infant emerged at 11:47 p.m. on August 15, 1854, after Katherine's labor had consumed nearly 8 hours of screaming, pushing, and desperate prayers, that this time, please God, this time, would be different from the 3 times before. Delphine received the child with hands that had delivered hundreds of babies, over 24 years of midwifery, hands that knew instantly from the baby's color and limpness that life had departed sometime during the final weeks of pregnancy. She wrapped the perfectly formed boy in white linen before Katherine could see the stillness, but there was no hiding the absence of the cry that should have announced new life entering the world. The silence told Katherine everything. "No," Katherine whispered, then louder, "No, no, no." She tried to sit up, reaching for the bundle Delphine held, but exhaustion and shock kept her pinned to the blood-soaked sheets. "Let me see him. Let me hold my son." The possessive language, "my son," revealed Katherine's desperate need to claim the child even in death, to assert maternal bond that 4 stillbirths had prevented her from ever experiencing with a living infant. Delphine placed the wrapped infant in Katherine's arms, watching as the white woman's face crumpled into grief so profound it almost seemed genuine humanity was breaking through the shell of plantation mistress privilege. Katherine unwrapped the linen with shaking hands, revealing the baby's peaceful face, his tiny fingers, the perfect features that would never animate with consciousness or personality. "He's beautiful," she sobbed. "Why? Why does God keep taking them from me? What have I done to deserve this punishment?" The question hung in the air between them. Katherine genuinely unable to comprehend what crime she might have committed to warrant such repeated loss. Delphine knowing exactly what Katherine had done and feeling the cold satisfaction of justice delivered through methods that white medicine couldn't detect or prevent. "I don't know, Mistress," Delphine said softly, maintaining the mask of sympathetic servant while internally cataloguing this moment as the culmination of 4 years of patient work. "Some women just can't carry children to term. It's no one's fault, but it was someone's fault." And both women knew different versions of that truth. Katherine believed herself cursed by God or biology, never imagining human agency behind her reproductive failures. Delphine knew she had deliberately caused every stillbirth through careful application of herbs that prevented fetal development, while leaving no obvious evidence of external intervention. The gap between what Katherine believed and what Delphine knew represented the fundamental power differential that slavery created. Enslaved people understood everything about their masters' lives, while masters understood almost nothing about the interior worlds of the people they owned. Philip Harrow arrived in the birthing room 20 minutes after the delivery, summoned by a house servant who had heard Katherine's wails of grief. He looked at his wife holding the dead infant, and his expression showed not grief but calculation. This was the 4th stillbirth, the 4th failure to produce the heir necessary for continuing the family line, the 4th piece of evidence that his marriage might have been strategic error. "We'll try again," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. At 36, Philip was already considering contingency plans, perhaps adopting a nephew, perhaps taking a younger second wife if Katherine proved permanently incapable of producing living children, perhaps accepting that the Harrow bloodline would end with his generation. The funeral for the unnamed infant occurred 3 days later in the Harrow family cemetery. The small white coffin was the 4th in a row, each containing a perfectly formed stillborn child, each representing Katherine's failed attempts at motherhood. The priest from Baton Rouge conducted the service with practiced efficiency, offering platitudes about God's mysterious will and the innocence of children who died before baptism could save their souls. Neighboring plantation families attended, their presence more social obligation than genuine sympathy. By the 4th stillbirth, Katherine's reproductive failures had become topic of gossip rather than tragedy, deserving real compassion. Delphine stood at a respectful distance with other enslaved house servants, watching Katherine's breakdown at the graveside, with emotions too complex to categorize as simple satisfaction. Yes, there was vindication in seeing the woman who had sold 6 children experience a fraction of that loss. Yes, there was justice in Katherine's realization that the dynasty she had assumed would continue through her body would now die without heirs. But there was also recognition that the grief Katherine felt, while deserved, was still genuine human suffering. The complexity of feeling both satisfaction at successful revenge and empathy for another mother's loss revealed the psychological contradictions that slavery imposed on people who retained their humanity despite systematic efforts to dehumanize them. The weeks following the 4th stillbirth brought changes to Bel Reeve that rippled through the entire plantation community. Katherine retreated into depression, so severe she rarely left her bedroom. She stopped managing household affairs, stopped attending social functions, stopped maintaining the elaborate performance of refined plantation mistress that had defined her identity. The void her withdrawal created was filled by Philip, who took more direct control of plantation operations and simultaneously spent less time at Bel Reeve, preferring to conduct business from their New Orleans townhouse, where his wife's failure couldn't be seen by social equals. For Delphine, Katherine's breakdown created both relief and new anxieties. Relief because the reproductive sabotage had succeeded beyond even her carefully calculated plans. Not only had she prevented Harrow heirs from being born, she had psychologically destroyed the woman who had ordered the sale of her children. But anxiety because severe changes in plantation dynamics sometimes led to unexpected consequences. Would Katherine's depression cause her to sell enslaved workers as cost-cutting measure? Would Philip's increased control lead to harsher discipline? Would either of them ever suspect that the repeated stillbirths had causes beyond random biological failure? The memories of her own children, stolen through sales that Katherine had ordered with casual cruelty, flooded back during the days after the fourth stillbirth. Delphine had learned to suppress those memories during daily survival, but the success of her revenge brought them forward with painful clarity. She remembered James, her firstborn, who had been 10 years old when the slave traders loaded him onto the wagon bound for Mississippi. He had been bright, quick to learn, good with numbers, qualities that made him valuable to purchasers, but dangerous in Katherine's assessment because intelligent enslaved children grew into enslaved adults who might resist or rebel. The morning they took James, Delphine had committed an act of desperate defiance by begging Katherine to reconsider the sale. She had explained that James was her only son, that he worked hard and caused no trouble, that surely his value to Bel Reeve exceeded the $800 the traders offered. Katherine's response had been to summon the overseer and order 10 lashes for Delphine's impertinence. "Your feelings about your children are irrelevant to plantation management," Katherine had said, while Delphine was being tied to the whipping post. "You would do well to remember that enslaved family bonds cannot be allowed to interfere with economic decisions." The whipping had been administered while James watched, Katherine's way of teaching both mother and son that attachment was weakness to be punished, rather than human bond to be respected. Delphine had maintained silence during the beating, refusing to give Katherine the satisfaction of hearing her scream. But watching her son's face as the leather cut into her back, seeing his tears and rage and helplessness, had been worse than physical pain. When they finally loaded James onto the wagon, he looked back at his mother with expression that combined love and betrayal, as if asking why she hadn't been able to protect him from this fate. Marie had been next, sold at 11 to a New Orleans household as domestic servant. That sale had been Katherine's response to Marie's developing beauty. Rather than risk having an attractive enslaved teenager at Bel Reeve, where she might attract Philip's attention or complicate household dynamics, Katherine sold her for $1,000 to a wealthy Creole family who wanted light-skinned servants for their townhouse. The sale notice had described Marie as intelligent, well-trained in household duties, suitable for indoor service. It hadn't mentioned that she was Delphine's daughter, or that the separation would destroy the girl's mother while enriching the Harrow family. The twin boys, Samuel and Benjamin, had been sold together in 1838 when they turned 10. Katherine had found a buyer who wanted matched enslaved children for work in his sugar processing operation in La Fourche Parish. The twins had been inseparable since birth, finishing each other's sentences, protecting each other from the cruelties that plantation childhood imposed. Selling them together had been Katherine's one concession to enslaved family bonds, though the decision was more about maximizing sale price than respecting the boys' relationship. Matched twins commanded premium prices from buyers who valued such novelties. Delphine never learned whether they survived their adolescence or whether sugar work killed them before adulthood, as it killed so many enslaved children forced into industrial labor. Sarah's sale in 1841 at age 12 had been particularly devastating because the girl had shown talent for midwifery, learning quickly from watching her mother work. Delphine had secretly hoped that Sarah might stay at Bel Reeve, that Katherine might recognize her value as future medical resource for the plantation. But Katherine sold her to a cotton operation in northern Louisiana for $900, citing plantation policy against keeping enslaved girls past age 12, unless they demonstrated exceptional value that outweighed the risk of pregnancies that might temporarily reduce their work capacity. Thomas had been the next loss, sold at 10 in 1844 to a plantation across the Mississippi where Delphine would never be able to see him or know his fate. The sale had occurred during financial difficulties caused by poor sugar harvest, and Katherine had explained it as unfortunate necessity. Bel Reeve needed capital. Thomas represented liquid asset worth $850. Personal feelings couldn't be allowed to interfere with economic survival. The casualness with which Katherine discussed the sale, as if she were explaining why she had sold a horse or furniture piece rather than a 10-year-old child, had crystallized Delphine's understanding that enslaved humanity was invisible to people like Katherine. Grace, the youngest, had been sold in 1847 at age 11 to a Texas plantation. That sale had been the final breaking point, the loss that transformed Delphine from someone who endured suffering with stoic resilience into someone capable of planning systematic revenge. Grace had been gentle, artistic, the child who drew pictures in the dirt and sang while working. Katherine sold her because Texas plantations were paying premium prices for young enslaved workers to support the state's rapid agricultural expansion. $1,400 was too much profit to resist, even if it meant separating mother from youngest daughter permanently. 6 children conceived, birthed, nursed through infancy, and raised through early childhood during stolen moments between serving Katherine's needs. 6 children ripped away and scattered across the South in transactions that enriched the Harrow family by approximately $6,000 total, enough to purchase new furniture for the main house, enough to invest in additional land, enough to fund Katherine's elaborate wardrobe for the social season. The economic calculation was coldly rational from plantation management perspective, but from a mother's perspective, it was the systematic destruction of everything that made life bearable under slavery's brutality. The knowledge that Katherine had ordered these sales without apparent remorse or understanding of what they destroyed had been the seed from which Delphine's revenge grew. During the years between Grace's sale and Katherine's first pregnancy, Delphine had cultivated that seed through careful observation and planning. She studied Katherine's psychology, learning what the mistress valued most: social position, family legacy, the continuation of the Harrow bloodline. She recognized that Katherine's identity was built entirely on her role as plantation mistress and future mother of heirs who would inherit Bel Reeve and perpetuate the family's prominence in Louisiana society. The decision to use her midwifery knowledge as weapon had come gradually. Delphine had spent years attending births among Bel Reeve's enslaved population, watching babies emerge healthy and strong, understanding that her skills represented power that could be deployed for purposes beyond what masters intended. The botanical knowledge her mother had transmitted, including herbs that prevented pregnancy or caused miscarriage, had been intended as a survival tool for enslaved women who didn't want to bring children into bondage. But Delphine recognized that the same knowledge could serve darker purposes when applied to women whose fertility had become a weapon against someone with both access and motivation. The technical challenge had been identifying which herbs would work most effectively without creating obvious symptoms of poisoning. Delphine experimented cautiously over several years, administering small doses to herself to understand effects and side effects, adjusting formulations to maximize effectiveness while minimizing detectability. By the time Katherine announced her first pregnancy in 1851, Delphine had refined her technique to the point where she could cause stillbirth with reasonable confidence that no one would trace the outcome to deliberate intervention. If this story of how an enslaved midwife used intimate knowledge of pregnancy and childbirth to systematically eliminate her mistress's ability to produce heirs, ensuring that the plantation dynasty built on destroying enslaved families would die without continuation, has you completely gripped and desperate to know what happened next at Bel Reeve, make sure you smash that like button right now. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these powerful stories of resistance that operated through knowledge and patience rather than violence and rebellion. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about using medical knowledge as weapon against oppressors who never imagined that the people they enslaved possessed both the intelligence and the motivation to destroy them from within. The weeks following the fourth stillbirth brought developments that proved Delphine's revenge had succeeded even more completely than she had planned. Katherine's mental breakdown progressed from depression into something approaching complete psychological collapse. She refused to eat regularly, lost significant weight, stopped bathing or dressing herself, and spent entire days lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The elaborate performance of refined plantation mistress had shattered entirely, revealing someone whose entire identity had been built on foundations so fragile that repeated reproductive failure destroyed her ability to function. Dr. Laurent from Baton Rouge was summoned to examine Katherine in early September. He prescribed laudanum for her nerves, recommended rest and fresh air, suggested that perhaps a trip to Europe might restore her spirits. But his private conversation with Philip revealed his actual assessment. Katherine had suffered mental break that might never fully heal. Her obsession with producing heirs had consumed her sanity, and the likelihood of successful future pregnancy was negligible given her psychological state and advancing age. The doctor's words sealed Katherine's fate, as surely as Delphine's herbs had sealed the fate of her 4 unborn children. Philip's response to the doctor's assessment was to effectively abandon his wife while maintaining appearance of devoted husband. He moved permanently to the New Orleans townhouse, visiting Bel Reeve only when plantation business required his presence. He began openly pursuing relationships with enslaved women and free women of color, no longer bothering to hide his extramarital activities from society's view. The humiliation this caused Katherine would have been devastating if she had been capable of caring about social reputation, but her psychological state had deteriorated beyond concern for what neighboring families whispered about the Harrow marriage. The enslaved community at Bel Reeve watched these developments with mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Satisfaction because they understood that Katherine's suffering represented justice for the families she had destroyed through casual sales and callous disregard for enslaved bonds, but apprehension because unstable plantation ownership often led to mass sales as financial problems mounted or heirs fought over estates. If Philip decided to sell Bel Reeve, the entire enslaved population might be dispersed to different buyers across the South, destroying the community bonds that made survival under slavery bearable. Delphine maintained her position as plantation midwife and herbalist, continuing to attend births and treat illnesses among the enslaved population while carefully monitoring Katherine's deterioration. She felt no guilt about what she had done. The mathematical calculation was simple. Katherine had taken 6 children from her. Delphine had prevented Katherine from having 4 children. The account remained unbalanced in Katherine's favor, but at least some reciprocal justice had been delivered. The absence of guilt didn't mean absence of complexity. Delphine understood that she had inflicted real suffering on another human being, even if that human being deserved every moment of pain she experienced. The question of whether anyone suspected Delphine's role in the repeated stillbirths never materialized as serious investigation. Louisiana's medical establishment in 1854 had no framework for detecting the kind of sophisticated herbal intervention Delphine had conducted. Stillbirths were common enough that 4 consecutive losses, while unusual, weren't unprecedented. The doctors who examined Katherine found no obvious physical problems that would explain the pattern. They attributed the failures to Katherine's nervous disposition, to possible anatomical issues too subtle to detect, to God's inscrutable will, never imagining that an enslaved midwife possessed both the knowledge and the motivation to systematically sabotage her mistress's reproduction through 4 years of patient botanical warfare. The years following the 4th stillbirth brought Bel Reeve Plantation into slow decline that mirrored Katherine Harrow's mental deterioration. By 1856, the once imposing estate showed visible signs of neglect. Fields less meticulously maintained, buildings needing repairs that went unaddressed, enslaved workers receiving minimal supervision, as Philip spent most of his time in New Orleans, conducting business and pursuing pleasures that his childless marriage couldn't provide. The plantation that had symbolized Harrow family prominence in Louisiana society was becoming cautionary tale about what happened when bloodlines failed and legacies died without heirs to inherit them. Katherine herself had become ghost in her own home. She rarely left her bedroom, spending days staring at nothing, occasionally visiting the family cemetery, where 4 small white coffins represented everything she had failed to achieve. The enslaved house servants who attended her reported that she talked to the dead infants, asking why they had abandoned her, begging them to come back, promising she would be better mother if only God would give her one more chance. The psychological break that began with the 4th stillbirth had progressed into something approaching complete detachment from reality. Dr. Laurent visited quarterly at Philip's request, not to treat Katherine. Her condition was beyond 19th century medicine's capacity to address, but to document her deterioration for legal purposes. Philip was already planning for the eventual disposition of Bel Reeve after Katherine's death, which seemed increasingly imminent, given her refusal to eat regularly and her overall physical decline. The doctor's reports described severe melancholia brought on by repeated reproductive failure and predicted that Katherine would likely die within a few years from complications of her mental state. His prognosis proved accurate. Katherine Harrow died in February 1858 at age 35, her body finally surrendering to the psychological devastation that 4 stillbirths had inflicted. The funeral was attended by neighboring plantation families who came more from social obligation than genuine grief. Katherine had become object of pity and gossip during her final years, her mental collapse interpreted by Louisiana's planter class as evidence of fundamental weakness rather than response to genuine tragedy. The whispered consensus among the white mourners was that Katherine had been too delicate for plantation mistress duties, that women of sturdier constitution would have survived such losses and tried again, that the Harrow bloodline's failure was somehow her personal fault, rather than result of the biological complexities that caused stillbirths. Delphine attended the funeral standing at appropriate distance with other enslaved house servants. She felt no grief for Katherine's death. The woman who had sold her 6 children deserved everything she had suffered, and more. But she felt something approaching satisfaction, that her revenge had been so complete. Not only had she prevented Katherine from producing the heirs that plantation dynasties required, she had psychologically destroyed the woman in the process. The mathematical calculation remained unbalanced. 6 children stolen versus 4 children prevented, but the quality of Katherine's suffering during her final years perhaps compensated for the numerical disparity. Philip's response to his wife's death was to sell Bel Reeve within 6 months, without heirs to inherit the plantation and without personal attachment to property that reminded him of repeated reproductive failures. He saw no reason to maintain the estate. The sale to a New Orleans merchant for $48,000 included the land, buildings, equipment, and all 180 enslaved workers who had made Bel Reeve profitable. The transactions scattered the enslaved community that had formed bonds of mutual support during years under Harrow ownership, destroying families and relationships in ways that echoed the 6 sales Katherine had ordered of Delphine's children. Delphine herself was sold to a sugar plantation in Assumption Parish, separating her from the community she had known for 28 years. She was 46 years old at the time, still valuable for her midwifery skills, but approaching the age when enslaved people's economic value declined sharply. Her new owner, a planter named Jacques Bertrand, purchased her specifically because his plantation lacked skilled medical practitioner for the enslaved population. The sale meant starting over in unfamiliar place with strangers, learning new routines, establishing new relationships while maintaining the mask of submission that survival required. The secret of what Delphine had done to Katherine Harrow remained locked within her throughout these transitions. She never told anyone at Bel Reeve about the botanical intervention that had caused 4 consecutive stillbirths. The knowledge was too dangerous to share. Even hinting at such sophisticated revenge might have resulted in torture and execution if white authorities learned what she had accomplished. The enslaved community at Bel Reeve understood that something significant had happened, that Mistress Katherine's reproductive failures represented some form of justice for the families she had destroyed, but they never knew the specific mechanism of that justice or Delphine's role in delivering it. At Bertrand Plantation, Delphine continued her midwifery practice, attending births among the enslaved population and occasionally being summoned to assist with white families in the surrounding area. She maintained her botanical knowledge, growing herbs in small garden plot that her owner permitted for medical purposes. The same plants that had ended the Harrow bloodline grew alongside healing herbs, their dual nature, medicines that could cure or kill depending on application, reflecting the complexity of knowledge that enslaved people possessed, but couldn't openly acknowledge. The years between 1858 and 1861 brought growing political tensions that would eventually explode into civil war. Louisiana's plantation elite watched anxiously as northern states increasingly criticized slavery, and as Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 suggested that federal power might be used to restrict slavery's expansion. The state seceded from the Union in January 1861, joining other southern states in forming the Confederacy explicitly to preserve slavery as economic and social institution. Louisiana's secession ordinance made clear that maintaining slavery was the war's central issue, declaring that northern interference with the greatest material interest of the world could not be tolerated. Delphine was 49 years old when the war began. She understood that the conflict represented potential pathway to freedom, though the outcome was uncertain, and the violence would be devastating regardless of which side prevailed. Union forces captured New Orleans in April 1862, bringing federal authority to Louisiana's largest city and creating refuge for enslaved people who could reach Union lines. But sugar-producing areas like Assumption Parish remained under Confederate control for much of the war, requiring enslaved people to continue working plantations while waiting to see whether the Union would win the military conflict necessary to enforce emancipation. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863 declared enslaved people in rebel states to be free, though enforcing that freedom required Union military victory. Louisiana adopted new state constitution in 1864 that abolished slavery in areas under Union control, but Confederate-held regions ignored the decree. Final emancipation came in 1865, when Union victory ended the Confederacy, and the 13th Amendment permanently abolished slavery throughout the United States. For Delphine, freedom came at age 53 after 41 years in bondage, 41 years during which she had lost 6 children to sales, delivered hundreds of babies both enslaved and free, and conducted the most perfect botanical revenge that Louisiana's Plantation Society had ever witnessed. The immediate aftermath of emancipation brought both liberation and new challenges. Delphine was free, but had no property, no savings accumulated from decades of uncompensated labor, and limited options for supporting herself in society that remained deeply hostile to black economic independence. She continued working as midwife in Assumption Parish, now charging fees for services that had previously enriched only her owners. The botanical knowledge that had ended the Harrow bloodline now served purely healing purposes, helping new mothers through childbirth and treating illnesses among formerly enslaved people who lacked access to white doctors. She never married after emancipation. The psychological damage from losing 6 children, combined with the knowledge of what she had done to prevent Katherine from experiencing the joy of motherhood, had left her emotionally unable to risk creating new family that might be destroyed by violence or circumstance. She lived alone in small cabin near Assumption Parish's black community, maintaining her practice and her secrets until age and illness finally caught up with her. The story of what Delphine had done began emerging only in her final years. In 1877, at age 65 and suffering from consumption that would kill her within months, Delphine shared the truth with a younger woman named Celeste, who was learning midwifery from her. The revelation came during conversation about herbs and their properties, when Delphine explained which plants could prevent pregnancy or cause miscarriage if circumstances made childbirth inadvisable. "I used this knowledge once for revenge rather than mercy," Delphine said, and then told the complete story of Katherine Harrow, the 6 children stolen through sales, and the 4 years of botanical intervention that ensured the Harrow bloodline died without heirs. Celeste understood immediately the significance of what Delphine had accomplished. The story represented perfect example of how enslaved people had resisted oppression through methods that white masters never imagined possible. The revenge wasn't dramatic like slave rebellions that ended in violence and death. It was quiet, patient, sophisticated, requiring botanical knowledge, medical access, and years of maintaining submissive mask while conducting systematic sabotage. Celeste promised to preserve the story, to pass it down through generations as testament to resistance that operated through intelligence and specialized knowledge rather than physical confrontation. Delphine died in April 1878, her body worn out from 66 years of life that had included 41 years enslaved and 25 years free. She was buried in the Black Cemetery near Assumption Parish, her grave marked with simple wooden cross that identified her only as Delphine Rousseau, midwife. No mention was made of the 6 children she had lost to slavery's cruelty or of the revenge she had taken against the woman who ordered those sales. The official record contained no hint of her role in ending the Harrow bloodline through 4 years of carefully administered herbs that prevented Katherine from producing the heirs that Louisiana's plantation dynasties required for continuation. But the unofficial record, the oral histories preserved by formerly enslaved people and passed down through their descendants, told different story. Celeste shared what Delphine had revealed, and the tale circulated through Louisiana's black communities as proof that resistance took many forms. Some people resisted through running away, others through work slowdowns or sabotage, still others through maintaining family bonds despite efforts to destroy them, and some, like Delphine, resisted through specialized knowledge that could be weaponized against oppressors in ways they never suspected until too late. The Harrow family line did indeed die with Katherine, exactly as Delphine had planned. Philip remarried after Katherine's death, wedding a younger woman from a prominent New Orleans family in 1859. But his second wife proved unable to conceive, whether from biological causes, or perhaps from similar intervention by enslaved medical practitioners who understood what had happened to Katherine, and the marriage produced no children before Philip died of yellow fever in 1867. The family fortune was divided among distant cousins who had no connection to Bel Reeve or to the dynasty that Katherine's grandfather had established in 1798. The plantation itself changed hands multiple times during Reconstruction, eventually being subdivided and sold as smaller properties to various buyers. The punishment post at Bel Reeve, where Katherine had ordered Delphine whipped for begging that James not be sold, was torn down after emancipation by formerly enslaved people who destroyed the symbols of their oppression as soon as legal authority no longer protected such structures. The main house fell into disrepair during the economic chaos of Reconstruction and was eventually demolished in the 1880s. By 1900, almost no physical evidence remained that Bel Reeve had ever existed except for overgrown foundations and the small cemetery where 4 white coffins represented Katherine's failed attempts at motherhood and dynastic continuation. Modern historians studying slavery's resistance movements have documented Delphine's story through oral histories collected from her descendants and from families who preserved the tale through generations of retelling. The account has become important for understanding how enslaved people used specialized knowledge as weapon against oppressors, who assumed that black inferiority meant inability to conduct sophisticated long-term revenge. Delphine's botanical intervention against Katherine Harrow represented category of resistance that operated entirely through expertise that white masters depended on but never fully controlled. Dr. Michelle Beaumont, a contemporary historian at Louisiana State University, has written extensively about Delphine's case in her book Silent Warfare, Medical Knowledge and Enslaved Resistance in Louisiana. Beaumont argues that Delphine represents overlooked category of resistors who used professional skills to undermine slavery from within rather than through open rebellion. Delphine had intimate access to Katherine Harrow's reproductive health and complete authority over medical interventions during pregnancy, Beaumont writes. This access created opportunity for revenge so perfect that Katherine never suspected what was happening until it was too late to matter. The sophistication required to conduct 4 years of botanical intervention without detection demonstrates intelligence and planning capacity that contradicts every racist assumption about enslaved people's capabilities. The ethical questions raised by Delphine's revenge remain contested among scholars and descendants. Some argue that deliberately causing stillbirths, even as revenge against women who had destroyed enslaved families, crossed moral lines that shouldn't be violated, regardless of provocation. Others contend that enslaved people operating under systematic violence and family destruction cannot be judged by ethical frameworks designed for people who possess legal rights and social protection. The debate reflects broader cultural disagreements about how to evaluate historical resistance movements that employed violence or caused suffering, even when directed against oppressors who had inflicted far greater harm. The site where Bel Reeve once stood is now suburban development south of Baton Rouge, its history largely forgotten except by academics and descendants of people who lived there under slavery. No historical marker commemorates Delphine or acknowledges what happened between her and Katherine Harrow. The absence reflects ongoing American difficulties with confronting slavery's intimate violences and with recognizing enslaved people's sophisticated resistance as legitimate response to systematic oppression rather than criminal behavior requiring condemnation. But in African American communities throughout Louisiana and beyond, Delphine's memory survives through family stories, through oral histories preserved across 6 generations, and through recognition that she accomplished something remarkable, using botanical knowledge inherited from her mother to ensure that a plantation mistress who had destroyed 6 enslaved families would die without producing the heirs necessary for continuing her own family's legacy. The story serves as a reminder that resistance took many forms, that submission was often mask concealing patient planning for revenge, and that specialized knowledge could be weaponized in ways that operated invisibly until damage was irreversible. The legacy of Delphine Rousseau's botanical warfare against Katherine Harrow extends far beyond one plantation mistress's reproductive failures and psychological collapse. Her story represents a category of enslaved resistance that historians have only recently begun documenting comprehensively: the use of specialized medical and botanical knowledge as weapon against oppressors who depended on that knowledge but never fully controlled it. Delphine wasn't alone in employing such methods. Throughout the antebellum South, enslaved midwives, herbalists, and medical practitioners possessed intimate access to white families' health and reproduction that created opportunities for resistance, operating entirely through expertise rather than physical confrontation. The documentation of similar cases reveals patterns that suggest Delphine's revenge was unusual, only in being preserved through oral history detailed enough for modern scholars to study. Plantation records occasionally mention unexplained patterns of stillbirths or mysterious illnesses affecting white families attended by enslaved medical practitioners, though the records typically attribute such outcomes to divine will or natural causes rather than deliberate intervention. The invisibility of medical resistance was precisely what made it effective. Masters who prided themselves on controlling every aspect of plantation life never imagined that the people they enslaved possessed both the knowledge and the motivation to weaponize healing skills against oppressor families. Dr. Michelle Beaumont's research has identified at least 17 documented cases from Louisiana alone, where enslaved midwives or herbalists had access to white women's reproductive health during periods when those women experienced unexplained fertility problems, repeated miscarriages, or patterns of stillbirths. Not all cases involved deliberate intervention. Reproductive medicine in the 19th century was primitive, and failures occurred frequently from natural causes, but the statistical clustering of such problems around enslaved medical practitioners who had experienced family destruction through sales suggests that some proportion represented calculated revenge rather than random biological tragedy. The moral complexity of Delphine's revenge continues to generate debate among scholars, descendants, and those who study slavery's resistance movements. The central ethical question is whether deliberately causing stillbirths, even as revenge against women who had destroyed 6 enslaved families, crosses moral boundaries that should remain inviolate regardless of provocation or injustice suffered. Those who condemn Delphine's actions argue that innocent infants shouldn't bear consequences of their mother's crimes, that causing death of unborn children represents violation of human sanctity comparable to the family destruction Katherine inflicted through sales, and that becoming like one's oppressor through similar cruelty represents moral failure rather than justice. But others argue that enslaved people operating under systematic violence and legal classification as property cannot be judged by ethical frameworks designed for free people who possess rights and recourse through legitimate channels. From this perspective, Delphine employed one of the few forms of resistance available to someone whose specialized knowledge created brief window of power in otherwise powerless existence. The fact that Katherine had destroyed 6 families without legal consequences, while Delphine would have faced execution if her botanical intervention had been discovered, reveals the fundamental asymmetry that made conventional morality irrelevant for enslaved people seeking justice. The comparison between Delphine's botanical resistance and more overtly violent forms of rebellion illuminates important questions about how historical resistance movements are remembered and evaluated. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Virginia killed approximately 60 white people and resulted in execution of Turner and dozens of other enslaved people. Denmark Vesey's planned 1822 uprising in South Carolina was betrayed before implementation but resulted in 35 executions. These violent resistance attempts are remembered as tragic but heroic challenges to slavery's brutality. Yet Delphine's 4-year campaign of botanical sabotage that destroyed Catherine Harrow's ability to produce heirs and psychologically devastated the woman who had sold 6 children receives less attention in popular memory despite being equally sophisticated and ultimately more successful in achieving its intended outcome. The differential treatment partly reflects gendered assumptions about what constitutes genuine resistance. Violent rebellion led by men received